Mona, in your book, Headscarves and Humans, Why Do Middle East Need Sexual Revolution, you wrote that women need a double revolution. So what does it mean?
The double revolution that I refer to in my book is the revolution that, on one hand, is all men and all women against the state, against the dictator in the presidential palace, which in my country's case was Hosni Mubarak. The other revolution that women need is the revolution against the state, the street, and the home, which is what I call the trifecta of misogyny. Because when Egyptian women joined Egyptian men in the revolution, or Tunisian women, or Syrian women, and all the other women who joined revolutions and uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa that began in 2010 with Tunisia, they joined them all because they understood that the state oppresses everyone, men and women. But when women looked at the men they marched alongside, they understood that the state alongside the street and the home, i.e. those men who are our allies in the revolution, all of those, that trifecta of misogyny, oppress women specifically.
A headline of your text is "Why do they hate us?" and you thought of men who actually hate women. Why do you think that men hate women?
Right. This is the title of an essay I wrote in 2012 for Foreign Policy magazine that then became the basis of my book. And I focus in that essay on the Middle East and North Africa because I'm from that part of the world. I'm Egyptian, I'm Muslim, and I lived for many years in Saudi Arabia. But of course I mean misogyny that is across the world. And I answer that question in my book, and I believe that men hate women because they can't control us, because they're scared of the fact that they can't control us, because they want to control us enough to make us good girls, to wait to have sex with them, to produce the sons that they want, that then we are supposed to teach how to be misogynist against us. And so I took the opportunity of the revolutions and uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, and uprisings everywhere, you know, whether it's the Occupy movement in the United States, whether it was the protests against austerity measures in the UK, whether it's protests also in Greece and Spain, and now you're seeing them in Catalonia. So anywhere where you're seeing uprisings and revolutions, we have to ask why the men in all those parts of the world hate women and why patriarchy and misogyny too often go unquestioned. And I think that the title of my essay is especially pertinent today, as so many women across the world are sharing stories of sexual harassment and sexual violence in the wake of the scandal against Harvey Weinstein, the top Hollywood producer. Nowadays, I think this is a really important question to ask, because some people thought I was just talking about the Middle East or just Muslim men or just Arab men. But I think today especially it's a reminder that I'm talking about all men. And we have to use this opportunity, this hashtag #MeToo that has spread all across the world, to ask why men and why patriarchy and why misogyny are all allowed to operate with such violence against women, whether here in Croatia or in Egypt or in the United States.
And how have you resolved your doubts about wearing hijab?
I began to wear the hijab when I was 16 years old, and my family had recently moved to Saudi Arabia. And as I said, I'm a Muslim, and I was taught that this is how Muslim women should dress. But the more I wore the hijab and the more I read about feminism among Muslim women, the more I began to question whether this was really an obligation or not. And I've read the Quran dozens of times, and I no longer believe that the hijab is an obligation. I speak openly about the fact that I wore hijab for 9 years, but that it took me 8 years to take it off, because I believe that too many Muslim women and girls are not allowed to question the hijab, are not allowed to question the idea that it's an obligation, which I no longer believe. And I'm thankful for the Muslim feminists who helped me pose that question and who helped me resolve that question. And I hope that my own writing helps other younger Muslim women. And I hear from those younger Muslim women who write to me and say, and ask, you know, how did you take off your hijab? And I recommend to them the writings of those Muslim feminists who helped me.
Okay. And after brutal assault by Egyptian police, you dyed your hair red, yes, and you got tattoo. Why? What does that symbolize to you?
Right. In November of 2011, so during the year of the revolution in Egypt, I joined a protest in a street called Mohammed Mahmoud, which is one of the streets that branches off from Tahrir Square. And I actually used to visit this street every day when I was at university, because I used to go to the American University in Cairo, which back then was along that street, Mohammed Mahmoud. So in November 2011, there was a 5-day protest by us, the revolution, against the police and the military. And during those 5 days, the Egyptian police and soldiers killed at least 40 people and injured at least 300. And I'm among those 300. An Egyptian riot police broke both my arms and sexually assaulted me, and I was detained for 12 hours, 6 hours by the Ministry of the Interior and 6 hours by military intelligence, during which I was blindfolded and interrogated. And during that whole 12 hours, my arms were broken and I was denied medical attention. So for 3 months after this assault, both of my arms were in a cast from up to here to up to here. And so I couldn't write. You know, I'm a writer and I use all my 10 fingers on my keyboard. I could just use this one finger on, you know, to tweet and on my touchpad. So I was very frustrated and very angry at the fact that as a writer, I was denied the ability and the right to use my fingers. So I promised myself that when my bones healed, I would reward myself for surviving by dyeing my hair red, because red is a very fierce color, and red says, fuck you, I survived, you did not kill me, and I'm here and I'm not hiding. Because very soon after I was assaulted, I decided to move back to Egypt. And I wanted to move back to Egypt with bright red hair so I could be seen, so that the regime understood that I was not scared. Because at the time I lived in New York, but after my assault, I moved back to Egypt. So I wanted the regime to know that I'm here with bright red hair, where you can find me because I'm not scared of you. And I also promised myself that I would get tattoos on both arms, because on this arm I needed surgery because the bone broke like this. So I got surgery and I have a titanium plate with 5 screws and a very thin scar. I'm very proud of this scar, but I didn't choose this scar. So I decided to get tattoos because I wanted to get marks on my body that I chose, to say that I own my body, not the sexual assault and not the riot police. And I speak very openly about my sexual assault because, again, across the world, women are shamed by sexual violence. So it's my way of saying, I'm not ashamed. I've done nothing to be ashamed of, and the shame belongs to the perpetrators, to the assaulters. So on this arm, I got a tattoo of the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. And she has the head of a lioness and she has the body of a woman. And she's the goddess of retribution and sex, because I say I want both. I want retribution, or more justice, and sex. So I say yes, please, to both. And on this arm, I got the name of the street where I was assaulted in Arabic calligraphy, and the Arabic word for freedom, also in Arabic calligraphy, because this is my heritage as an Egyptian, and this is my heritage as someone whose mother tongue is Arabic.
And the children are not informed about sex and sexuality from their parents.
Well, in Egypt and many countries across the Middle East and North Africa, and generally in conservative cultures, also in parts of the United States where they practice what they call abstinence-only sex education. Yes, there isn't sex education in school, which is a big danger. And this is one of the things that I discuss in my book as necessary for the sexual revolution that I talk about in my book. Because when you're not taught about sex, because when you don't talk about sex openly, when sex happens in the dark and under taboos and with a lot of shame and silence involved, the people who are hurt the most are those who are most vulnerable. And in many parts of the world, actually all over the world, the most vulnerable are always women, girls, and people who belong to the LGBTQ community. So it's one of the goals of my work and one of the goals of my feminism is to talk about sex openly and to talk about the need for sex education. But to talk about sex openly also to talk about pleasure. Because even in countries where sex education is taught, like in the UK, for example, I spent 8 years as a child in the UK. Even in countries where sex education is taught, children aren't taught about pleasure. They're taught about how to use a condom, how to prevent pregnancy, and how to prevent sexually transmitted infections. But they're not taught about pleasure. So one of the things that I insist on talking about is sexual pleasure and desire, especially when it comes to women and people of the LGBTQ community. Because as someone who survived sexual violence, it's very important for me that I talk about sex openly and to move beyond sex and its association with violence, and to say that I deserve pleasure and that I own my body and it's my right to experience it pleasurably, whether with a man or a woman or multiple men and multiple women. So that's one of the ways that I break my own taboos as an Egyptian and as a Muslim, but also that I break taboos that prevent women and LGBTQ people from owning our sexuality and talking about it openly all over the world.
And for the end, if we can point out. How would you describe someone that actually sexual freedom is essential human right?
How do I show it in my work?
Yeah.
Well, I tell people when I talk about the sexual revolution, what I mean by that, and this is a revolution that is necessary across the world, but I talk especially as a Muslim Egyptian woman. I'm also a US citizen, and I think this also applies to the United States, because there's a lot of puritanical thoughts about sex and sexuality in the United States to this day. When I talk about the sexual revolution and the need for it, what I'm talking about is this idea and this belief that I own my body. And when I say I own my body, I'm saying that not my family, not the state, not the mosque or the church or the temple, not the streets, none of them own my body. I own my body. And what does that mean? It means that when I fight against female genital mutilation in the countries where it's subjected on girls, that's a sexual revolution. When I talk about and I fight against domestic violence or marital rape, that's a sexual revolution. When I talk about fighting against street sexual harassment, that's a revolutionary act. When I talk about women's right to pleasure, and when I say that I own my body, that means that I can choose whomever I want to have sex with, obviously with their consent, whenever I choose to have sex, with a man, with a woman, with multiple men or multiple women. When I say that, that's a revolutionary act. So that's why the sexual revolution is important. This idea of women owning our bodies, that is a revolutionary idea. Because when I look at the United States, as I said, I'm Egyptian American. When I look at the United States, the president of the United States today, Donald Trump, is a sexual predator. He's been accused by several women of sexual harassment and assault. Donald Trump is the head of a political, or he represents a political party, the Republican Party, that doesn't believe a woman owns her body because they want to deny women reproductive rights and they want to deny women the ownership of whether to continue a pregnancy to full term or not. So when I talk about the sexual revolution, it's as equally important in the United States as it is in Egypt. And I often sum it up when it comes to religious conservatism. Again, whether it's Catholic conservatism in Croatia or other parts of the Christian world, or whether it's Muslim or Jewish or Hindu conservatism. I address the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, I address the Christian Brotherhood, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, I address the Hindu Brotherhood, because I see all of these religious groups are obsessed with women's vaginas specifically, and they're obsessed with our reproductive rights. And I tell all those religious brotherhoods to stay out of my vagina unless I want them in there. And when I say that, that's a revolutionary act. That is at the heart of the sexual revolution.
Thank you.